Okay, what I'm going to try to talk about today is pretty complicated. So I'm going this presentation is based on a paper that Renee and I published last fall, and the DOI is there. It's an open access paper, and if you really want to understand this, you have to read the paper, okay? Because I can't even begin to get into the details on it. This analysis is based on one of those 20-year data sets of Renee's. They did this for Holmgren's milkvetch from 1991 through 2012. And in 2013, Renee came to me and said, I have some money from the Nature Conservancy to do a population viability analysis for this model. Will you please help me do this? So that's how we began to work together on this project. It's taken a long time to see it all the way to fruition. So this is our species. This is the color panel from this nice open access journal article. Many of you are familiar with this plant. It's a perennial spring ephemeral, which means it's only active in the spring. The seedlings and the adults emerge in the spring. The seedlings don't make seed. The adults do. And then everybody goes to sleep in June, and they sleep all the way through summer, fall, and winter, and wake up in the spring again and go through their cycle again. So they're only there in the spring. The seeds can persist in the soil for at least 9 years. They're only gradually released from dormancy. And we know from Renee's long-term data that there are years when there are no seedlings and no adults. It looks like the plant is gone. And then the next good year, it returns from the seed bank. So that's sort of the way this works. So we took all of her data and all of our knowledge of this plant from various other studies on seed production, seed bank persistence, and spring seedling recruitment. We took all that together with this 22-year demographic data set and used a type of PVA called stage-based discrete time population matrix modeling. And our objective wasn't so much just to find out whether it was going to go extinct or not. It was to find out what factors are most important in whether it can survive and which aspects of its life history were most key to its survival. So we built a base model, and the base model was built on our best estimates. Okay, this is called a life cycle diagram, and the arrows connect the stages, and each stage is a condition a plant can be in a given year. It can be in one of 3 size classes, or it can be in the seed bank and have been there for various numbers of years, okay? Or it can be sitting in the soil non-dormant. Those are the stages. The arrows are the transitions that connect the stages, and each arrow represents 1 year of time. The arrows are the transitions, and they are made up of vital rates. For instance, the transition from a small plant to a medium plant is made up of what's the fraction of small plants that survive times the fraction of the surviving plants that became medium plants. So survival is a vital rate. Transition to a different size class is a vital rate. And we use the demographic data across 22 years to calculate the means and the variances of each vital rate, and also the correlations among them. They're correlated because they're driven by the same precip patterns. So we use these measured vital rates and then calculate the transition probabilities. And those are, the vital rates are statistical distributions. They have a mean, a variance, and a set of correlations. So then we use those to calculate the transition probabilities for each time step of the model, which is 1 year. Okay, I'm not going to explain this and you're not going to understand it, but the model is executed for 1,000 iterations based on random draws from the vital rate statistical distributions, and it's run for 50 years. So it pretends like it knows what the weather's going to be each year for 50 years by drawing from these vital rate statistical distributions. And then it calculates from that data the population growth rate for each iteration. So it's estimated 1,000 population growth rates, and then it takes the average of those to give you a mean stochastic lambda or population growth rate. And the way this works is that if the population growth rate is more than 1, it indicates average population growth. If it's less than 1, it indicates average population decline. So what's different about our model is we have typically, okay, this whole idea of population viability modeling was developed for animals, okay? Animals don't have seeds. If you can't see the animal, it's generally speaking not there. So there's been very little work on dormancy or seed banks, all of that. Those usually aren't included even in plant population viability analysis. So I want to focus on what you need to know to do one of these viability analyses for a desert plant that grows in a highly variable, a highly what we call stochastic environment, which means it varies randomly from year to year. And in the Mojave Desert, the variation is extreme, from like almost no rain to like 5 times the average. So there's tremendous variation from year to year. That's, if you're in that kind of an environment, the means don't mean anything. So what are the vital rates you need to know in order to come up with a PVA that's even remotely realistic? Okay, there's a set of 4 vital rates for Holmgrens that we needed that vary with year. They vary according to year quality. There's germinant survival to census. That is, if a seed germinates, what's the probability that you'll have a juvenile plant there at the end of the spring? That's a very hard thing to measure. We were able to do that with experimental data, but that's a very hard transition to get. Okay, once it's survived to census, then what is the probability that it will survive the first dormant season and come back up the next spring? That's first year dormant season survival. And then those adults that come up, how much seed are they going to produce? And when they go back to sleep, what's the probability that they're going to survive for another dormant season? So those are the 4 variable vital rates that you really need to have to run this kind of model. But the second kind of vital rate you really need, if the plant forms seed banks, you cannot make a realistic PVA if you don't have seed data, and very few people do. And the thing that's interesting that I've discovered about these species is their seed dormancy loss rate does not depend on the weather. It's constant through time. And that's a very key thing in how seed dormancy loss is insensitive to the weather, which means if there's an absolutely fabulous year, the seeds don't all germinate. Only the ones that have lost dormancy germinate. And that's very important to the outcome of the model. So what I'm going to show you, just to give you an idea of how this works, is what happens if you change these key vital rates. How do they affect, number 1, on the right-hand side, how do they affect mean stochastic lambda? And on the left-hand side, how do they affect the probability of extinction within 50 years? And I got to tell you, this is just for our teeny tiny little minuscule plot. These extinction probabilities don't apply to the whole species. They just apply to this tiny population that Renee was able to collect data from. But it gives you relative differences. This is all about relative differences. So you can see that if you change germinant survival to census, okay, for starters, the base mean stochastic lambda is well over 1. It's like 1.08. This means that on average, this population is going to be able to persist through time. In fact, according to that, it's going to grow by 8% every year. But remember, that's just the average. If you drop germinant survival to census in the model by 50%, then mean stochastic lambda now goes slightly below 1. So it had a big effect. Red is the base model, and black is the model run that represents a 50% decrease in the vital rate. And you can see it raised the extinction risk quite a bit too. So bear that in mind. Changing germinant survival changed things quite a bit. Changing first year dormant season survival. This is what's the chance that a seedling or a first year recruit that goes to sleep is going to wake up the next spring. Again, the base model stays the same. This didn't have as much effect as germinant survival reduction, but it still dropped stochastic lambda by a good chunk. Maybe it dropped it from 1.08 to 1.035, something like that. So it had an effect, not as much as changing germinant survival. Okay, here's the interesting thing. This is the effect of changing adult dormant season survival. It has no effect. That means that once the plant has had a chance to produce seed, which it will in the first year of adult life, then it doesn't really matter whether it dies after that, as far as whether the population will be able to persist. All it has to do is make seeds the first year it's an adult, and that's what's important. So the emphasis is on reproduction early in life. It cannot reproduce as a seedling, it can't make seeds. But the first year it's an adult, that's really the key to how this population persisted. Okay, here's the effect of changing the seed production per adult. It had a huge effect, right? It also dropped stochastic lambda down to below 1. So it says if you cut the seed production per adult plant by 50%, you're going to push this thing down to a level where it might not be able to survive. But I do need to tell you one other thing. If you run this model deterministically, which means you say every year is the same, if every year is an average year, if every year is an average year, lambda, deterministic lambda, is down here below 90%. So this is a drop, but it's not a drop as if every year were average. Okay, here's the clincher. This is what happens to stochastic lambda and extinction probability if you shorten the length of time that a seed remains dormant. So we're saying in the base model, we're saying there's still dormant seeds left from a recruitment, left from a reproductive episode. There are still dormant seeds left 9 years later. That gives us the base model. If you say the seeds, and notice that our scale has changed completely on this graph. If this is the base at 1.08, if you say the seeds can only last 1 year, you have reduced mean stochastic lambda to 0.4, which means this thing is going to tank. And if you see the curve, the extinction curve, it says that it has like a 90% probability of extinction in 10 years. So the moral of this story is what's really important here is the persistent seed bank. It's good if germinants survive. It's good if first year plants survive to adulthood. It's good if the adults make seed, and it's okay if adults survive more than 1 year, but if the seeds cannot persist in the seed bank, it's game over. It's the most important thing. And it's the thing people never measure. So what are the take homes? I'm going to just kind of read these so I don't leave anything out. Extreme precipitation variation causes extreme variation in vital rates and population numbers. This is a highly, highly stochastic environment, and it causes the vital rates to vary over extremely wide ranges. Some years the vital rates can be 0, none. Some years they can be very high. So that's the first thing. It's a highly stochastic environment, and we have that in the demographic data, and it's supported by the model. The model is expected on average. It says the population will grow through time. But the problem with that is that all this stochasticity means the variance around that mean is very high. In other words, of those 1,000 iterations, maybe a fairly high percentage of them, just by chance, have a series of draws that represent awful years. And if you have a draw of awful years for too many years in a row, that's going to mean the population in that particular iteration would go extinct. And there's a lot of those in 1,000 iterations. Many of them predict extinction. It's just that on average, the prediction is for growth. So that means you cannot use a stochastic PVA to predict extinction. You can't predict extinction. You'd have to be a psychic who knew what the weather sequence was going to be in order to know the probability of extinction. So if people tell you that a PVA can predict extinction for a plant in a stochastic environment that forms a seed bank, like for instance, Penstemon grammii, I'd like to see how they did their PVA. Okay, the third thing is this species depends on environmental stochasticity for persistence. And this blows people away. If every year were average, the species would go extinct. In other words, the average year isn't good enough to support the plant. So the only way it can survive is with high stochasticity. You have good years with high rainfall where plants survive dormancy and they produce a lot of seed as adults, where there's high recruitment. You have to have years like that, right? But the flip side of having boom years is there's going to be years when it doesn't rain. And the only way that this stochasticity can benefit the species is if it has a seed bank. If you can't have any advantage of stochasticity unless the seed bank is there to facilitate survival through the dry years. So what's the life history of this plant and how is it different from most perennial spring ephemerals? The high overdormant season of mortality is compensated by the high episodic seed production, frequent recruitment, the presence of a persistent seed bank. Why is there high overdormant season mortality? Because these are, here's a $10 word for you, these are hemicryptophytes, which means they're perennials that go dormant, that have their meristem right at the surface. And the surface of the soil in the Mojave Desert can be 60 degrees centigrade or higher in the summer every day. And that's a hard place for a dormant meristem to survive. That's why there's such high mortality, probably. So, but that's compensated. It has evolved to act more like an annual. It's still a perennial because it doesn't only live 1 year, but it acts more like an annual. It has more emphasis on high reproductive output and on seed longevity. And as we saw in the simulation, adult longevity beyond the first year of seed production doesn't really have much effect. And the last thing, and I already presented on this at our meeting last year, the model suggested that we should be able to use direct seeding to establish new populations of these species in suitable unoccupied habitat, because it's the presence of the seed bank that determines whether the population will maintain itself, not the presence of plants. So if you put enough seeds out there in the right kind of place, it will establish a population, or it has a high probability of doing that. And we were in fact able to take the advice of our own model and get that to work. So some acknowledgements. The field work was supported basically by Ron Bolander for a long period, 22 years, supported by the BLM state office and the St. George field office. For the PVA, that was funded by the Nature Conservancy, and I believe they were just funneling money from Fish and Wildlife Service. We want to thank Ali Searle, who was there for most of this data collection and also helped with the data, getting the data collated so that I could put it into the model, and also the many students who helped with data collection. We'd like to acknowledge Dr. Harper, who was also my mentor early in my career and a valuable Utah botanist who contributed a huge amount. He was involved in these long-term studies with Renee for years and years. And lastly, I want to thank Renee for working closely with me to bring this project to fruition and for having faith that it would finally see publication. It took a long time. I got the runaround from reviewers who would not believe that you could have a model that stochasticity would improve lambda. They didn't believe it. The model is correct. And I finally found reviewers who could understand what we were talking about. I mean, any desert rat knows this is how the plants work, but the modelers couldn't buy it. So it was a long process, but we finally have this beautiful publication. And I want to thank Renee a lot for working with me and not giving up on me when I kept getting rejections and having to redo the paper over and over. But now it's done. Thank you. I am done.